Welcome, everybody, to Parallax Lectures. I'm your host, Tom Mamark. This would be the 11th episode of Parallax Lectures. We try to bring in new and interesting people with new, exciting thoughts and have a presentation here that will go on for like 45 minutes generally, and then we have a Q&A and a discussion. You can find all the upcoming events on the Parallax website. I can post the link later. And of the previous ones, you can also find them there. Today, our guest is Jeremy Johnson. Jeremy Johnson is a writer and a podcaster himself, an expert on Jean Gebser. And I very much welcome him to Parallax Lectures. Jeremy, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
Of course. How are you doing?
Doing good. Enjoying lockdown as best as I can, and keeping busy. Many coals in the fire, as I was just mentioning before we started recording. Book writing projects, editing, conversations. It's been quite a good time to talk about topics like this, right? I think as we are beginning to think about structures, systems, whether or not we're doing something correctly, economics, and whether or not we can do things differently. So I think, just generally metamodernists and integralists and Gebserian takes on all of this is just people are very hungry for it right now. So that's been encouraging.
New ways of sense making, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
And so yesterday,
Exactly.
A video by those folks at the store was posted where you attended a podcast with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
How was that?
That was quite a thing. I mean, one of the benefits maybe of the pandemic is everyone's on Zoom, including Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky's actually on Zoom quite a bit. I've seen him pop up all over, and he's kind of on a digital lecture circuit, and maybe it's because he's 90 plus and he's just like, let me get my voice out there and engage the generations as much as possible. But yeah, it was good. Peter Lindbergh reached out to him. He agreed for the conversation, and really good questions by everyone else who was involved in the panel. Each of us had a question or two for him, and they were sort of like, how to put it, subtly trying to put forward a sense-making question. Right. But, obviously Chomsky's more involved in the political sphere and linguistics and economics and all of that, of course. So I appreciated the ways in which, let's say, like Bonita Roy asked her question, like kind of talking about the tensions between parochialism, as she framed it, and internationalism. Right. I asked him a similar question, like, what is the role of a public intellectual to be essentially a generalist, right? And then also to connect the dots and to somehow promote or encourage international thinking, right? That doesn't come off as elitist or kind of too cosmopolitan, right? Like, how do we actually fold in these different, not only demographics, but sort of cultural worldviews, right? That was the sort of theme. And I think his answers are really interesting.
Nice.
So.
I mean, like what I always think, it's like there are so few of those people left from the older generation. I always try to reach out to Umberto Maturana. I don't know if you know him. He's also like 90 and the father of systems theory. It's very hard to get hold of those people because basically they're all dead by now. Wilbur is still there, and to get the chance to talk to Chomsky, it must have been exciting, I think.
Oh yeah. It was a great honor to be able to ask him a question. So very, very appreciative for Peter for putting that together. And the Stoa too is sort of as this interesting hub for those sort of conversations. You got the sense makers, you've got different people on the political spectrum, and interesting mimetic mediation practices. So yeah, they're doing good work over there.
Yeah, I know. All right, Jeremy. So your talk, what will be about, basically?
So essentially, I think for newcomers to Gebser, what I want to do is give a little bit of an introduction to Jean Gebser's life and work, and then pivot, and this can even be more of a dialogical thing with participants as well, but pivot into our contemporary felt sense of time, space, the kind of structure of feeling of the pandemic and the sort of meta crisis that we're in, to kind of really feel into what Gebser's talking about, right? Because as I think this year has highlighted, the best teacher for really learning about the structures of consciousness, or really kind of grokking what Gebser was talking about, what he meant by integral consciousness and his approach and methodology, is just to kind of lean into the felt sense of being in the present, right? And being in the kind of cultural present, particularly in terms of like, how does our feeling of time, how does that arise for us? What is emerging in culture right now? What is the discourse? What are the tensions and anxieties? And what can that tell us about our own shifting structure of consciousness? So we're going to lean into that, hopefully, and get some interesting responses from participants as well.
Hopefully. Okay, Jeremy. So I think, I guess you have the floor now. I'm looking forward to it. And well, here we go.
Here we go. All right, Tom, let me just share the screen here. And for participants who are familiar with Gebser and my work, you'll probably have heard some of this before, but hopefully it won't be too iterative here. So yes, so I think it would be good to start, as we said, begin at the beginning in talking about Gebser's work and life. Many of us are probably already familiar with the terminology integral or integral consciousness. And most of us are probably familiar with more of the developmental-oriented theorists who have popularized this terminology, like Ken Wilber, in the transpersonal movement, a lot of the folks who are doing this work today, the metamodernists who also talk about a kind of development or developmental spectrum of consciousness. Gebser is one of these foundational thinkers for this milieu. I call it an integral milieu in my book, just in terms of there's a constellation of thinkers who are integral oriented, who may have used the language integral to talk about their theory or their theory of everything, or their discussion about the next phase or stage or structure of consciousness. Gebser's one of these folks. And as I've mentioned, he was sort of foundational in the context of being, born in 1905, lived through 2 world wars. He lived through a lot of the tectonic and dramatic, events in Europe, just in terms of everything he actually literally lived through. And maybe we can make a few notes about that as we go along. But he was interesting in the sense also that he was a bit of a wanderer. He left Germany fairly young and moved into, spent some time in France. He spent some time in Spain. And as things were picking up, leading to the First World War, he actually had a few close calls, few brushes with death, actually. Whether we're talking about, leaving his apartment in Spain like an hour or 2 before it was bombed, to nearly being executed at the border of Spain, trying to get out of Franco's Spain, leaving the occupied France just a few hours before the borders closed with Switzerland, but he ended up in Switzerland. And in any of his kind of biographical notes that we can mention too, he tended to find himself in interesting intellectual and cultural circles, whether it was in Spain with bohemians and artists and poets like Lorca, France, he was speaking with folks like Sartre, and other thinkers at the time. The sort of existentialism was sort of percolating there. And then when he was in Switzerland as well, he was talking with and sort of hanging out with the folks at the Eranos lectures, right? So the Eranos lectures you might be familiar with, between Jung or Eliade, later on James Hillman. So he was always kind of finding these spaces, and he was very much a part of them. But Gebser himself, I think, is lesser known as this sort of hidden figure in these circles, which is unfortunate because Gebser's own contributions, I think, to the history of consciousness, to contemporary integral theory, and then also to beyond integral theory, commenting on cultural phenomenology and metamodernism and sort of the conditions of our present moment. He has a lot to contribute. And this is generally why I've gravitated towards his work. For myself, I was drawn to his work fairly early on, being an avid Wilber reader in undergrad and kind of scouring the Wilber's footnotes and endnotes and sources and finding Gebser and going, well, I should probably read some of the foundational texts that Wilber was drawing from. And it was really kind of kind of had my own like flash of insight reading Gebser for the first time. There's something about his writing style that even makes it through the translation, a kind of a poetics, and it's very dense. It's very intellectual. It's a very much a kind of dense, dramatic philosophical text, ever-present origin, and yet there's something that moves and shapes and really kind of reshapes you as you read it. And I noticed this immediately, and it has to do particularly with his insight here and the way in which he approaches the evolution of consciousness that I find to be, if not singularly unique, then very unique amongst folks who talk about consciousness evolution, right? There are other texts that we can think of that would be a parallel for Gebser's work, Up from Eden, with Ken Wilber, Atman Project, Sex Ecology, Spirituality. These are like, one or two of the texts that really kind of influence people. Erich von Neumann's Origin and History of Consciousness, Carl Jung, right? Gebser's one of these figures, and his book is most definitively one of those kinds of books, The Ever-Present Origin, that has something profound to share in its scope. So what makes this, or what interested me at first, was for Gebser, integral consciousness has to do with our relationship to and with time. It also has to do with our relationship with the present, time in the present. You could say that Gebser's study is a phenomenology of consciousness, the way in which time and space have shifted and transformed, and sometimes dramatically so, over the vast history of consciousness in very kind of qualitatively unique ways, right? And interestingly for Gebser as well, what happens with his approach is really a kind of artistic, aesthetic, cultural study. So I have here the German word, which Tom would probably pronounce it better than I can. So I'll just say the English is the phenomenology. The phenomenology of the becoming of consciousness. So that means. There we go. The phenomenology of the becoming of consciousness. And what does this mean? It means it's a study in which, again, understanding how our relationship with time and space, our subjectivity of time and space, our sense of self and world have undergone these dramatic transformations. And for Gebser, this began very early on with an interest he had in Bohemian poetry and the new arts. Oh, I think we're getting a little interference, so there we go. Somebody's enjoying a bag of chips. I hope they're tasty. So yes, most of this has to do with a relationship for Gebser in his early studies. Poetry. He was interested in Rilke's poetry. He was interested in what the new poets were doing with the German language and with European languages, how the language and the expressions and utterances themselves were evidencing a new relationship with time, a new relationship with the past. And so his earlier work is very, and you'll see the same kind of sensitivity that you find in his later work, but is very much focused on literature. And similar to Owen Barfield, actually, another great scholar of consciousness from England, who wrote a number of books like Saving the Appearances, which again studied how language evidences a transformation of consciousness, a transformation of culture. The meaning of a particular word, is it ambiguous? Like, for instance, pneuma, right? Breath. It no longer means spirit for us in contemporary English-speaking world. It means just breathing, right? It doesn't mean spirit. But in an older usage of the word, it had a different relationship and had more ambiguity. It had more layers of meaning. And so studying the evolution of consciousness through this evolution of aesthetics and language was really where Gebser began, particularly poetry, but it began to expand. He began to sense like, well, okay, there's Rilke over here, but then you also have, scientists, just talking about like Heisenberg, for instance, the new quantum sciences, talking about this in their own way. You had the eruptions of artists who were breaking apart three-dimensional space and perspective, right, in their particular art, Dadaists and Surrealists, etc. So we have a lot of these sort of cultural transformations that are taking place. And in some ways, Gebser is very similar to, let's say, the academic metamodernists that look at the structure of feeling, right? And they look at particular works of art that evidence a structure of feeling or a shifting sense of self. Or describe that, right? So Gebser is kind of similar in this regard. He's very descriptive oriented. He's trying to get into or get behind the felt sense and the feeling and the shifts and the changes of self and world that are going on through this art, through this making. So, little nutshell of his work there. But I listed a couple of books on this slide, right? Like there's Rilke in Spain, which is his earlier work. There's his sort of mid-work, Transformations of the West. And then, of course, Ever-Present Origin, which kind of put him, was really his landmark book. I think it was his seminal text, and his magnum opus, as it's called, in 1949, and then a second edition in 1952, which for me, both sections of the book are really important. The first is sort of a foundation at the whole history of consciousness. And then the second part of the book, the first is foundations and the second part is manifestations, and that is really important because he was looking in his time sort of the whole history of temporics, the whole setting up of the integral world, you know, over the past 200 years leading into his present, and then a very, very extensive study of arts, sciences, literature from his time, psychology from his time, architecture, music, as a very interesting and very expansive scope, just like looking at it, everything and trying to discern and tease apart emergent themes. What do they all have in common? What are the motifs? What are the characteristics of what he described as the aperspectival world? And on that note too, I think if I could just get the slides here, take a look at what I've got. On that note, part of this shift, right? Part of this aesthetic relationship with time and space that was shifting for Gebser, he initially used this language. He talked about perspectivity, aperspectivity, unperspectivity. What does this all mean? For Gebser, perspective is, you know, I think we're familiar with this if you've ever taken an art class. It's having a sense of three-dimensional space, right, on a two-dimensional plane. The ways in which artists were developing a capacity to actually express space through their art, really kind of incorporating that into themselves and into their culture. And this represented a kind of shift away from the medieval orientation of what Gebser called the unperspectival world, right? Or as I say, you know, this sort of the vaulted cavern of stars, like the enclosures of sacred spaces, the enclosure of a geocentric cosmology, right? We saw this sort of rupture of that bubble, that closed cosmology that had to do more with imagistic and psychistic and perhaps archetypal powers and presences out in the world, and more now leaning into the realization of three-dimensional space, right? The secular world, the birth of modernity, the emergence of the sciences and the Renaissance arts, etc. And with that kind of emergence of perspective, Gebser talks about, well, this also helps to shape the individuality, right? To stand apart and to observe the whole is to have a relationship with it, right? There is now the observer, there's a vanishing point, there's a kind of a sectoring of reality, and there's also a kind of, now we know where we stand in relation to the whole. And in fact, one of the problems with this is this perspectival sectoring off of the part, rather than participating in the whole through some kind of imaginal sense or religious sense, is what begins to allow us to sort of individuate from that, but it also unmastered, or let's say over-determined, creates a sort of crisis of increasing hair splitting and increasing fragmentation. And it's set up here. And so this is sort of Gebser's introductory realization, I think, with the breakthroughs in the 20th century in the arts and sciences, this is the world that is now being disrupted, the perspectival world, the world of three-dimensional space, right? The world in which rationality and measurement are ways in which we can sense make successfully and find consensus, find solid ground. That same capacity to sectorize reality begins to break up that solid ground. And so we see a lot of this reflected in the arts, especially in the early 20th century, in the new physics, etc. And I borrowed these slides from a McLuhan lecture because I think Marshall McLuhan is another interesting figure who really talks about this. And go figure, he was another literary scholar who moved into and really developed the field of media studies. But for McLuhan, he's also very interested in how the medium of electronic culture breaks up this three-dimensional sequential and linear space, this new mentality that was arising for McLuhan in, let's say, the 19th century with the advent of the telegram and electronic communications. So he has a different emphasis there. But McLuhan is very compatible with Gebser, and the recently departed William Irwin Thompson talks about this quite a bit in his book, Coming into Being, which I highly recommend as well. So we have this move, right? We have these overarching shifts in consciousness in which our relationship with our sense-making and our world and our definition of the world, is it three-dimensional perspectival space? Is it imaginal participation, right? Are changing once again. And we find ourselves in one of these situations still. And in many ways, I would say that what was going on in the mid-20th century for Gebser and what he was speaking about the breaking down and the breaking up of this perspectival world, has only intensified today. And so many of the themes and motifs that Gebser was talking about during his time in 1949 could be transported into the present in a kind of eerie way, in the sense that they sound like Gebser sounds like he's talking about today. And I'll give you, some thematic examples. The breakdown, let's say, of communication, people being able to speak to one another, the hyperfragmentation of communities into these hyperpolarized oppositionalisms, the atomization of culture, the retraction of meaning from the three-dimensional world, right? These are the kind of themes that I think, John Vervaeke might describe, if he was familiar with Gebser, he might describe Gebser as a prophet of the meaning crisis, because Gebser very thoroughly and independently has developed a historical process of how this meaning crisis occurred, how meaning has withdrawn from the world, and how our orientation and our structures of consciousness in its own process of evolution is partly responsible for that, right? But the other side of this, as we've been hinting at, is not just the breakdown and the fragmentation and the shattering of perspective into a million different fractal pieces, dissonant pieces. There's also this incipient mentality. There's also this new, I would call it not just like a phenomenology of culture, but a new ontology, right? What is being? What is real? And this has to do with this new sense of time and space that I think is sort of coming online ever so incipiently at the moment. But I want to give you a little bit of an overview as well, just in terms of the structures of consciousness. We've been going through the broad brush of the unperspectival enclosure of the ancient pre-modern world. And we've been talking about the birth of the modern world. And for Gebser, he wasn't alive for really the emergence of postmodernism. He was there for the post-war, post-war intellectual thinkers. But he would probably see the postmodern phase as a phase of the perspectival world, right? Because what is postmodernism about, right? It's taking that ability to discern and make the cut, right? To sector that piece of reality, to deconstruct, and it's taking that to another level, right? It's beginning to take that and fold it upon itself and begin to question our assumptions of language or gender construct, etc. So that deconstructive capacity of the postmodern is a sharpened and perhaps fractured blade of the modern. And so for Gebser, he would see this as a continuity. So I want to take us back now, because I think we have to really discern what the integral actually means. In ever-present origin, Gebser began to develop more qualitatively distinct expressions here, and he called these the structures of consciousness, rather than just say, okay, there was the unperspectival world before perspective, then there was perspective, and now this is breaking apart and there's something else. Those are three general contours, and we almost might say that they're kind of historical contours. Because when Gebser did his study and he began to distinguish these different structures of consciousness, we can get a little bit more distinct about them qualitatively. And each one of these, as we can kind of see in this slide, has a particular relationship with time and space. The archaic is a kind of, George Feuerstein called it a maximum latency. So all of the different structures of consciousness, time-space relations are dormant and almost sleeping in the archaic, a kind of a deep, dreamless sleep. With the magic, is this sort of first, in a certain subtle sense, a division, but also it's creative expression, right? It is a sense of timelessness, of a timeless present or timeless now. In which we are participating in the world in a kind of acoustic sense. Think again to that vaulted image of the cavern, the closed cosmology that envelops us. For this, the magic is a kind of acoustic reverberation. McLuhan talks about this as well when he talks about auditory cultures as being acoustic. When you're in the cave, sound is holistic. It reverberates on your skin. You participate in it. It's difficult to kind of slice it up with the vision, the piercing vision of the eye that can measure. Rather, it's the ear that hears the whole. Right, so there is this immersion or participation and entanglement, and the sense of time is this kind of timelessness. Right, and Gebser talks about the fluidity of human consciousness in this structure as being almost oscillatory between the human and the non-human, becoming animal. Right, as Deleuze might say, or David Abram has popularly talked about in his book, same titled. So there's this permeability, there's a capacity for trance, there's a capacity to move into kind of collective consciousness with the group or the tribe, with the non-human world. And then with the mythic, we introduce a different sense of temporics. For the mythic, there is the introduction of rhythmicity. There is the introduction, a kind of withdrawing of the entanglement with the world, the continuum of the imagination and the non-human world and the material world and the magic begins to center into the human, right? It begins to fold into, Gebser says, he talks about myth as the awakening of the soul. So it's no longer an entanglement, but now a kind of polarity. Think about night and day, winters and summer, waking and dreaming, right? There's this sort of complementary dance and rhythmicity that the mythic begins to bring online, and it has to do with the soul. And Gebser talks about the arising of myth with Plato, talking about with the emergence of the stars, there is the awakening of the soul. And I'm paraphrasing that badly at the moment. But with time and this sort of rhythmic, cyclic time comes the emergence of soul and soul making, image making. And it's very difficult to tease these two apart, as Gebser does it well. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that these are not, even in Gebser's writing, distinct stages of development. Rather, these are sense-making orientations that fold into one another. Even in, let's say, the magic period, where magic is a predominant form of consciousness in human beings, let's go back to the Paleolithic and imagine that for a moment, the mythic is still there. I mean, there's evidence of our ancestors using lunar calendars. There's the rhythmicity right there. There's evidence of our ancestors moving back and forth between different forms of social organization. So there's a kind of oscillation and polarity there of the mythic as well. And of course, as we move into the mental structure, and we want to talk about that for a moment, we could also say that capacity was very much in our ancestors in the Paleolithic as well. Directed spatial thinking is very good for hunting. It's very good for tool making, right? And it's very good for kind of planning different complex relationships with the land. It's having a sense of different intersecting cycles and seasons and migration patterns, etc. So the mental, as a kind of a spatial orientation, intensifies that centering of the mythic, the withdrawing of the world into the soul, right? Of the archetypal or psychistic world withdraws into the soul or the psyche. In the mental, then, the mental is kind of the almost the sporing bud of this psychistic center. It is the awakening consciousness, and Gebser spends quite a bit of time correlating the mental consciousness with the relationship, let's say, between well, we can talk about early Greek myths like Iliad, for instance, or talking about Achilles, where the opening lines is, sing in me, muse, the wrath of Achilles. But wrath for Achilles is in the Greek, I think it's menis, menis, which is related to mental. So Gebser makes this intimate link in mythology. He calls these mythologemes, right? Linking this mental consciousness with directed, wrathful thinking, right? The moving spatiality on let's say, the battlefield. And the mythic complementarity of these polarities become unstable. They become oppositional. They need to be reconciled, but they can be reconciled in the mental with abstraction. So we move from a kind of identity with soul making and the soul and complementarity and temporics as rhythmicity into more of a waking self sense, right? Into more of the self as the thinker, equating thinking with being, as Parmenides talked about. And so with this form or this structure of consciousness, we really kind of set up the contemporary world. But as you can see, all of these different structures, they really kind of they feed into one another in interesting loops, interesting interrelationships that are always dynamic, no matter what historical period you're looking at. But in general, this unfolding takes place where the mental consciousness becomes increasingly more predominant. Civilization, populations grow. We move into, let's say the Renaissance period, for instance, or we can talk about the mental in early, like let's say the Roman period and their perspective drawing with frescoes, etc. Or the birth of Greek philosophy, for instance, is one example of the mental, and the kind of myths that they talk about, like Athena birthing from the head of Zeus, right? Again, that kind of wrathful, furrowed brow, with directed thought. She is born, interestingly described as having like owl eyes, being able to see into the night. So there's this emphasis on sight, and she's born fully armored with a spear in her hand. So that if that's not an image of the mental, I don't know what is. But Gebser talks about the mental having, an abstract capacity to think about things, to reflect on things. You're no longer just immersing or participating in the mysteries. You're now able to distance yourself from that participation in order to think about it, right? The capacity for abstraction. And again, when we go back to what we were looking at with this image here, the capacity to stand back and observe and measure it creates this profound sense of self, right? So there is this emergence of the contemporary ego that the mental is also really doing here. That's important and critical. And for this too, in terms of the we can go again back to ancient Greece and talk about Odysseus saying "M Odysseus." He's not saying "I am Odysseus," but he's saying "M Odysseus." And when he's spit out from the sea, he is on the rescuing, or what do you call it, the waking shore, right? He's rescued by the waking shore. So there is a sense of an awakening of consciousness that's taking place in the mental, where the human being is able to distantiate themselves from the world in order to think about, in order to individuate, right? In order to even know their soul, right? To begin to reflect on our dream life, our psychic life, and to know it in this rational way is this newfound spatial abstract capacity. Now, with this sense of self, right, this directed sense of self is also a directed sense of time. And again, rhythmicity, complementarity, etc., really begin to recede and we get this stronger emphasis on clock time, chronological time, a consciousness of history, right? A progressive orientation, right? Time is moving forward. Time is advancing. We're moving away from, even look at all of the classical civilizations across the planet. They had some derogatory name for, non-civilized people, barbarians, etc. So there is this sense of moving ahead, moving higher up, right? That goes along with this mental consciousness. Now, Gebser's saying that something very profound is happening in over the past few centuries. He's saying that these mentalities, each of them, have had their particular day or night, might be more appropriate. We've had our unperspectival emphasis in the magic and mythic and archaic, and we've certainly had, in terms of the mental world, an emphasis on waking consciousness. So for Gebser, he's saying the integral is really a kind of a radical departure, in the sense that it's not just one new expression of consciousness, right? Each of these particular structures is part of the whole. And for Gebser, again, there's not a developmental sense. And in fact, he spends quite a bit of time saying, like, we really need to, part of what it is to come into integral consciousness is to begin to reflect on how mental and perspectival we are about how we organize ourselves in time and space, right? Moving from stage to stage in a linear sequence is very much a spatial orientation. We already are more than that. I mean, those of us who work with myth and the dream life and the psychic life and the archetypal dimension know that. Those of us who do some kind of animistic work or practice with the ancestors know this, that this magical relationship with the world has some co-validity with the mental along with the mythic. So for brevity's sake, with the integral, I think we get for the first time a capacity to be aware of these earlier forms of consciousness as they are in their co-validity, right? They co-constitute us, meaning the mythic has its own kind of genius. The magic has its own kind of genius, and they fold into one another in this dynamic and innate interrelated wholeness. And really, it's the integral consciousness that's actually able to render transparent these earlier structures, including the mental structure for the first time, really, in terms of its intensity, its clarity. So that really kind of sets everything up here for us to begin to talk about, like, what's going on in the present. But part of what's going on in the present, right, is a new relationship with time. Part of what Gebser talks about in terms of the crises that punctuate the emergence of a new structure of consciousness, rather, if we're talking about the mythic into the mental, it's hard to document that per se. But a lot of the myths talk about this sort of founding of the world from chaos, right? This sort of founding of, or the triumph of the waking consciousness over the oceanic myth, right? We have Odysseus and we have the Greek myths fighting these sort of archetypal forces and monsters over literally in the sea, right? The sea, always an expression of the imagination and myth. We have, Christ standing on the water, the image of the Logos, standing above the mythical waters of Oceanus in that sense. So there's always this kind of intensity and crisis and a need to bring forward a new consciousness that happens in these punctuated leaps. So for the mental, like the mythical, the mental has become deficient, right? For Gebser, the mental has become like the flood, like the archetypal flood, right? Like the psychic potencies of the mythical structure. The mental has overrun and overflooded us with its particular style of thinking. We're so fixated on that, and it has exacerbated many of the crises that we deal with today. And one of the linchpins that we can really talk about here with the birth of the integral consciousness or the integral structure historically has been the failure of the mental to integrate what has come before it, the magic and the mythic and the archaic, and by extension of that, to integrate time. For Gebser, the mental consciousness cannot master time in its fullness, in its complexity, in its process-oriented expressions. If we have a very spatial, sequential style of thinking, this is, for Gebser anyway, and I agree with him, McLuhan says something more or less similar, cannot deal with the simultaneity of the integral world, right, of things, of the entanglement of past, present, and future. Its way of sense-making collapses under the intensity of this new orientation. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, the second part of EPO, we've got quite a bit of an interesting historical analysis of this theme of time as it begins to press and intensify in culture. And we can kind of drop a few examples, right? Like we can talk about, if I can have them here, the kind of intensifications of the Industrial Revolution, the birth of the steam engine, the invention of it by James Watt, around the same period as the French Revolution, right? We have the Industrial Revolution picking up. We have the birth of modern capitalism kind of happening around the same time and really kind of taking hold with industrialization. These, for Gebser, are all about this unintegrated theme of time, and the capacity of the mental structure to almost try to always be, okay, let's try to master time this way. Let's master time as clock time, as sequence. Let's master time as something that can always go forward, right? Always go in a particular direction, better, faster, stronger, et cetera, et cetera. For Gebser, this is sort of the catching the tiger by the tail situation where the mental egoic spatial consciousness doesn't have an adequate intensity to actually break free into this aperspectival world, but it sort of sets the conditions for its own demise. It kind of sets things up for things to intensify. And he talks about this sort of process happening over the past 200 or 300 years. He talks about technology outdoes itself from year to year in shrinking space by mastering time and temporally condensing great distances. He talks about the airplane at the time. We could go to McLuhan, right? But he also talks about radio and television, nullifying space and time. He talks about them, describes them as accelerators. And in many senses, we have this sort of puts into perspective, if we may playfully use that word, the issues with, or what drew Gebser into being very curious about the new arts, because they, unlike Renaissance art, seem to have a new relationship with space and dimensionality. For Gebser, particularly Picasso's work, like the Renaissance artists, Picasso, for Gebser, was attempting to concretize, as he calls it, or depict temporality in his two-dimensional art, to try to depict movement in space, past, present, and future in a single crystallization. And so for Gebser, he thought, like, okay, that is the direction, the a direction that integral consciousness is attempting to realize in human consciousness and culture. So it's no longer a direction of sequence or linear stages or progress or the mastery of time through industry. There's something else going on here behind all of that. But the problem with this, of course, is many, many, many scholars have talked about this over the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The whole 20th century has really been this emergent theme of time eruption that Gebser calls. Gebser, of course, talking about the early futurists and surrealists and Dadaists, etc. In the early 20th century, they were playing around with these themes. This image in this earlier slide, the Italian futurists who were very interested in depicting time, but again, this very kind of mental time, this time that is shooting forward through industry. So they loved to celebrate the kind of I guess the bullet train would be a good example, or industrial warfare, or the airplane, or in my book I talk about the cyberpunk motorcycle, like racing into the megacity, as this great example and expression of the perspectival world being inflated and intensified by this unconquered and unmastered intensity of the aperspectival world of time. So it's been a theme. Walter Benjamin talked about this, talking about this sort of analysis of Paul Klee's painting, The New Angel, right? The nightmare of history, the catastrophe of history, that time is this wind blowing in from heaven that is blowing everything forward, and the angel is attempting to save people and to stop the winds, right? He has his back facing against the wind, and he's trying to protect, history from this catastrophe, but he can't, and everything's blowing forward anyway. That is the felt sense that Gebser was talking about with this time eruption, this unmastered time. And this has been a continuing theme for us in the climate crisis right now. Of course, we all feel, and we all talk about this all the time, that this is the theme of the crisis of time, that we can't slow down the momentum of an industrial, mental, rational civilization that has, an extractive economic model, an industry that has that relies upon increasing momentum every year, increasing higher and higher and higher heights every year. We don't know. We almost feel powerless to be able to change that. And I think this intensification has only ramped up. And Gebser probably would like this William Gibson quote. Gibson was talking about this in the early 2000s, but it's more true today, and particularly for 2020 than I think ever before. It says, for us, of course, things can change so abruptly, so violently, so profoundly, that futures like our grandparents have insufficient now to stand on. I love that line, insufficient now to stand on. We have no futures because our present is too volatile. We only have risk management, the spinning of the given moment scenarios, pattern recognition. There's a lot to unpack in that, but I think just for the general, for the brevity's sake of our chat here, this gives us a sense of, the felt sense of temporics that we're all beginning to lean into right now, or begin to really kind of feel as an anxiety or a pressure on us. And this is the kind of, again, this is the sort of unmastered techno-rational approach to time that the mental world has brought forth, but it can't finish. Right? It can initiate it, as Gebser says. It can initiate the integral world, but it can't substantiate it. It can't master it. So it sort of initiates this crisis, this unmastered form of time, which continues to press upon us more and more. And just to share like a few other notes before we can open up, I'd love to open up actually another slide here, if I can get that going. And this one, just a few examples for you, a few more short examples of this time eruption I think a lot of us have felt this year. I shared this with the San Diego Integral folks talking about this. This is quite an interesting article from The Guardian a few months back, where people are talking about the sense of time that this year has really brought up for them. This pandemic means we don't live in a timeline anymore. It's more of a time soup. As the hours, days, weeks, and months become a blur, it's no longer clear if time is passing too quickly or too slowly. I love this disorientation. It's really interesting. I think this is, many people feel this. And I don't think we should consider this to be like a blip. Like this is not just like an off weird year, right? Our sense of time is being challenged, is being deconstructed. Literally, it's becoming a time soup. I mean, this is exactly where we should be paying attention, because I think in terms of mastering the integral world and addressing the meaning crisis, and mastering the climate crisis, right? The kind of meta-systemic crisis that our sense-making communities talk about, a lot of that hinges on a new capacity to relate to time and space and self, particularly time. So of absolute critical importance that we explore this. This is another one from Kim Stanley Robinson, which was interesting. He didn't mention metamodernism, but this article is called "The Coronavirus is Rewriting Our Imaginations. What Felt Impossible Has Become Thinkable." The spring of 2020 is suggestive of how much and how quickly we can change as a civilization. And in this, he talks about a structure of feeling. He talks about the sense of time. He talks about the ways in which our culture is kind of restructuring to adapt to this new sense of time and intensity. Conversely, which I think is also part of this integration process, the barreling forward into the future, this now unchecked directiveness of the mental world, of the perspectival world, is conversely being challenged. We're being asked to halt abruptly. We're being asked to shelter in place. The economy is being, in fits and starts, arrested, and with devastating results, because we don't have an economic system that can deal with fluidity and flexibility of conditions. It has to always be going forward and marching ahead. So profound tectonic shifts and quakes have occurred this year, and these are ontological quakes. These are ruptures in the particular structure of consciousness of the perspectival world, of the mental rational world, that we are attempting now to metabolize. And if I bet anything on this, and I don't think we've had a sufficient enough rupture, and it's never just one, but we're probably going to need a lot of ruptures and a lot of shakes and quakes to really begin to realize that, okay, the ground in which we were standing on, the structure of feeling, our relationship with time and space, and the cultural manifestations thereof, economics, social systems, organizations of power and democracy, etc., the imagination of our own selfhood in relation to the non-human world, all of these things have to do with this new integral ontology, and they need to be looked at. So I don't want to go on too much longer. I know I've gone on a little over 45 minutes, Tom, but we can certainly open it up for questions and reflections, and maybe we can sort of narrow down some themes, because one of the things I didn't really get into too much is how much part of this crisis is like the hyper fragmentation and atomization of the perspectival world that a lot of sense-making communities are really interested in trying to mediate and solve. So that's another thing. And then the other one would be, what is our felt sense of time? Are we paying attention to this? How do we feel, everyone who's participating here? So.
Fantastic, Jeremy. Thank you very much for that presentation. Before I open it up, just a question from my side. So you were talking about these tectonical ontological shifts and quakes, that are happening to us in a kind of way. And so on the other side, you talk about mastery of integral consciousness and all those crises. So what does Gebser say in regard of this mastery? And is integral consciousness something that happens to us through these quakes, or what can we do to to strengthen our new view, so to speak? So what does he say to that?
Yeah, no, great question. In terms of how we can get in contact with it, I think Gebser leaves like a sort of implicit praxis that's like the subtext of his writing, and a lot of it has to do with actually doing the difficult work of refamiliarizing ourselves with the magic or the mythic, right? Paying attention to the present. So much of what integral consciousness is for Gebser is not a new layer of abstraction or conceptual complexity to kind of map out everything into a unifying theory. For him, it's almost a reversal, or like a folding back into the present, into the concrete, into the embodied. So for Gebser, I think for him it'd be like, well, do we have a non-abstract, tactile and poetic sense of the mythic or the magic? And can we live in that tension with our modern sensibilities that want to reject that, or say like, well, that's not real, right? That's just, that's a very pretty romantic image of the past, as, archetypally participatory world. No, can we actually have, this is something Cynthia Bourgeault talked about recently, perspectival humility, right, as a practice to remediate these structures. I think part of what we've seen this year is the crisis is really teaching us, right, this halting and arresting economics, et cetera, these social systems. It's really kind of forcing us to go like, there is another way of engaging time in the world. Slow down, actually be present, right? So I think that is the linchpin for us, is like, how can we learn to become more present, and can we learn perspectival humility in assessing and trying to reconnect with or reintegrate magic, mythic, etc., the unperspectival world. He talks about that quite a bit as sort of like a prerequisite to really kind of grok this sense of multi-temporality, because you'll start to do that if you're moving from our kind of modern sensibility and reintegrating unperspectival, the magic and the mythic. You're already kind of moving and paying attention to different time forms, different space forms, different ontologies, and that pliability and plasticity is part of what that integrality actually it begins to look like in a human being. So I think that's a good opening answer there for that
perfect.
question.
So everybody, could you please put your cameras on and your microphone so you can directly engage with Jeremy? Can you say something or?
Yeah, it's
Heather, I think you have to give us permission to start the video, Tom.
Yes.
All right. So now you should be able to, yeah, there you go. Perfect.
There you go. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
All right. Andrew, you had a question at the beginning.
Yeah. My questions kind of evolved as I've been listening to Jeremy. First of all, thank you. It was very eloquent and nice presentation of Gebser. I came upon Gebser this summer, largely from listening to you and began reading his book. And what occurred to me after reading it was I felt that what I was missing from Wilbur, and Wilbur had a big effect on me as well in my 20s, was really this aesthetic, artistic quality that the Gebser brings to the table. And that Wilbur was very much pushing the mental and the empirical and the scientific and the linear and I was missing something from that, not in terms of me agreeing or disagreeing, but just you know a felt sense. So that's one thing, one part of my question, which relates to art. And also I'm very happy that you put McLuhan and Gebser together because I've been studying McLuhan now and I hadn't kind of made the connection with this sort of this fact that time and space are sort of collapsing and we're living this aperspectival kind of state, experiencing all of these eruptions from, you know, all times simultaneously, in a sense, like we're really experiencing the magical and the mythical, and you know, we're experiencing all of these states kind of simultaneously, it would seem, in the internet age. So I wanted to hear about the difference between Wilbur and Gebser, and also art, and if you could relate that to art and technology, if that makes any sense. My question.
Oh yeah, good question, Andrew. Like you, I think I was very attracted to Gebser's poetic sensitivity, which does shine through even in the English translation. So it's encoded in and throughout ever-present origin. It's not really the statements where he's very direct, it's the statements where he's kind of abstruse about things, but in a poetic way that I for me have clicked and been the most profound moments of reading Gebser. So what the differences are, like, you know, why, what part of the question you asked earlier too about, like, you know, why is there so much bias toward, let's say, more left-brained, more analytical, more spatial? And I think it's because, you know, Gebser, this is my bias and this is my criticism of Wilbur, but I think Wilbur tends towards, I mean, he's very explicitly developmental. It's very much about a stage-centric theory in which we spatialize the evolution of consciousness. And it's a very brilliant theory, and I think you can do a lot with that approach. But I do think that, you know, ultimately what happens is that approach can't really contain the poetics. It has to get more and more and more complex. I did an interesting analysis of this a few years ago at a Gebser conference, talking about how, you know, part of the if we look at the kind of phenomena of the mental world attempting to master time, right, master this integral intensity, what we get is this sort of swelling and inflation of the mental consciousness as it attempts to get more complex, right, as it attempts to master, you know, the machine world, or and the image and the archetype, the mythopoetic archetype of cyberpunk, of anime. I talk about Akira as this sort of mythology of this interim age an age that is swollen by this integral intensity, but still kind of unmastered, right? And Tetsuo himself as the character is this kid who gets this mutant power, right? But he's very egoic. He's a 14-year-old kid. He wants to use it for his own devices, right? And he can't control it. It gets out of hand. He becomes this bubbling, monstrous techno-biological creature at the end, right? So I'm not saying Wilbur is that exactly, but I'm saying like the tendency to inflate conceptually and inflate to higher and higher scales of abstraction seems to be the response. And I see that tendency in Wilbur's work particularly. But I think, why is that popular? It's because it's our center of gravity. It's really difficult to like, Gebser spends quite a bit of time about this. Like, what is the new statement? We can look at the poetry, we can look at different and new poetic utterances that relate to time differently, but how do we have temporal concepts? What are the integral concepts that aren't completely spatializing? It's our center of gravity. How do we break free of that? And so we're just in this interim period where I think, Wilbur has been great for popularizing integral topics and integral literature. He's talking about the same, he's enveloping around the same material, emergence, consciousness, evolution. But I think the approach is still very centered in the abstract and the quantitative. And that just creates the difficulty there. And I think that's why his charts are skyscrapers of meta-rational thinking. Or Gebser, I think he by going to the poetic, he finds different ways to utter it in a much more kind of efficacious way, in my opinion.
Just a follow-up, if I may, and what I wanted to get to is this question of art. What it seems to me that in the present culture, it's very hard to define what art is, which brings us back to McLuhan, who said advertising is art, and our entire environment is a kind of artwork, right? And everything we're doing is art, but we don't know what quality art is, and we don't know what poetics are, and it's very hard to know who is the Picasso, because we're so, embedded in so much of this contemporary chaos. So I wonder, like, where do we go with art, and how can Gebser help us with that?
Good question. I think to some degree, I think about like McLuhan's cliche and archetype in response to that question, because in electronic culture, in particularly the internet age, the differences between the two, they're always kind of looping into one another, and it is very difficult to find the Picasso for the 21st century who is playing with time in an interesting way. I think individuals like that might continue to pop up, and there may be someone we're not aware of at the moment, but I think seeing the world as an aesthetic engagement right now is very useful, because I think people are playing with time all the time. And these are just like motifs. Like Gebser talks about, let's look at the motifs on a ceramic from the Greek age and how people are kind of flat and two-dimensional and entangled with like, vegetative, vines or something along those lines. And he's like, that's not to be overlooked. That's not just a flush or a flourish. That's telling us something about the way people were sense-making in the world. And I think, for us, in the absence of being able to locate a Picasso of the present, we should look to those motifs and flushes and cliches to say, like, okay, well, we are playing with time. I mean, Mark Fisher talks about this quite a bit in terms of temporics in popular culture. And I've really appreciated his work. It's very Gebserian in that spirit. But he talks, and this is my difference with him, he talked about like nostalgia. Particularly nostalgia right now is this motif that millennials play with, this kind of longing for the past or longing for particular aesthetic decades and bringing them back. And for Fisher, this is a sort of critique, is this comment that, the imagination seems to be impotent or frozen or captured by this capitalist realism he talks about. And I would say there's something a little more, I agree with a lot of his assessment, but I would say there's something a little bit more positive or constructive there. We're
McLuhan
literally
would
kind
say
of,
so, wouldn't he? I mean, McLuhan,
he would too.
A sense of nostalgia. He says we're looking at the world through a rear view mirror, and that's he saw that as a sort of, that's what people do to create things. We regenerate the past, or. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where I was going with that like moving into the past to playfully rearrange it and reassemble it with the present and remix these different aesthetics. That's actually a kind of incipient expression of this time freedom that McLuhan talks about with his simultaneity, and that Gebser talked about with his integral consciousness. So I see that as a sort of emergent motif. And there's a lot of layers to try to unpack that question, because, for instance, I think electronic culture and digital media, it is both expressing the new, and then it's also intensifying the old, in the sense that a lot of our internet activities can be very Cartesian, right? There's a lot of Twitter wars, and everyone's fighting each other online with their own kind of perspectival, fragmented gaze, right? There's this sort of sense of longing for embodiment, or a longing to fold the digital, the virtual into the material, right? That's the kind of poetics that we're reflecting on. And so I think that the tensions are still there in digital culture, but certainly the new sense of time is also there. The time play, and therefore the time freedom, is also there. And I think that's really, for me anyway, I always see that as like an exciting development in the present. But I would say for Wilbur, not to rail on him too much, but looking in the future through the rear view mirror is very much, I think, what he's doing, in terms of, he's got a very perspectival attempt to talk about integral consciousness. He's using a very perspectival approach to try to discuss all of these things, anyway, yeah, good reflections there.
Well, thanks so much. There's so much more, but let's, other people probably have other questions. I just struck by how Gebser really solves a problem for us. Like, he has a positive view which is very difficult to have at this point in time, because most people are so driven towards the dystopian view.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally how he opens EPO. Is like, it's typical of people who are living in a time of transition to be like proclaiming the collapse of civilization or the end of things, and not really see the beginnings. To be fair, it is a kind of existentially dangerous time, this bottleneck period, because of the intensity of the crisis, balancing, like having clarity, right? Like really going like, yes, here is how we cohere and clarify the new relationship with time. Here it is showing up across all these different manifestations in culture. That's great. But also, yes, there is this potential crisis that we're dealing with right now, right? So it's kind of holding both. It's neither blind optimism or cynicism. It's just something in between.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Somebody want to chime in on that topic? Heiner?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy, for putting all the work into Jean Gebser. We have met before virtually.
Yes.
I would like to discuss what happened to the reception of Gebser. I'm studying again and again his 60th birthday, big celebration, with all the architects, with all the political, physical, philosophical people of the world, and why maybe there was a communication flaw, or maybe the time changed, but maybe we should pick it up again. So I have this book here. It's a very rare one. Second, as you mentioned McLuhan, there was a Kim Feldman with whom we were planning a Gebser event here in Berlin, but unfortunately he died. He did with McLuhan the perspective unit. And then we started the Maastricht McLuhan Institute in the mid-90s. So there is not of knowledge, because he did all his life working on perspective to really go into what we mean by position and perspective and framing. And the last, I was working with Otto Scherli. He was something like a disciple of Gebser, and worked with Otto also with Kückelhaus, but he was like taking Gebser on as a mentor in the mid-late 40s. So he was longtime president of the Jean Gebser Society in Bern, to really look into the concretion. Jeremy, you speak a lot about space, but the German thinking is flat and deep. So trying to write spatial with C or with T makes all the difference. And so knowing his synoptical table, I feel much in the translation about wahrnehmen und wahrgeben. So many issues needs to be made concrete. And I tried to do that in 2001, and I will add the links. No, thank you very much. You have to come to Berlin sometime soon.
I would love to. I would love to. As soon as this is over, just as soon as this pandemic is over, it's time. Yeah, I know there was supposed to be German events. I'm speaking with Rudolf Hammerli a bit about checking out Gebser's archives, and so it's much anticipated. And thank you, Heiner. I mean, I agree, and there's some translations in the works. Not a retranslation of EPO, but new translations of his, both the older texts and texts that are after EPO, towards the end of his life, that are critically important. But yeah, I think you're right that there are some things that are kind of, like you say, they get flat in the reading. And, you know, again, just the way in which, you know, particularly in America, we talk about this historically for a second, like the transpersonal movement and its history in human psychology and human development is very much in the Wilberian phraseology, like upper left, individual focused. And I think it reflected the orientation of American culture anyway. So, you know, the transpersonal movement, that was its locus, and that was the way in which Gebser kind of got introduced. And so I think with Wilber's popularity at the time, he introduced a lot of people to Gebser, but he also kind of was this bottleneck where you kind of read Wilber and then you don't read Gebser because Wilber gave you the 15-minute breakdown of everything, so you don't have to bother. But when you actually read Gebser's, you know, it's a completely different, it's like reading McLuhan, it's like reading Jung for the first time. It could be very transformative, and it's doing something completely different than Wilber in terms of Gebser's writing. So I think just the timing, there was different confluences there, right? And with Wilber's meteoric rise, it kind of overshadowed Gebser for a bit. But he's coming back, apparently. There's a lot of discussion around him. I think, you know, I've tried to do some good work with my book and the American Gebser Society. And I think, again, you know, his themes are just more relevant right now. Like, they speak increasingly to the crisis that we're in terms of temporics, atomization, etc. And they get under it. They get under it in a very deep way that I think really is addressing some of these issues. But yeah, thank you, Heiner.
There was somebody else who wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. When we were talking about the arts, and I wanted to mention, I'm a dancer, I wanted to mention that modern dance, contemporary ballet is really opening up to a new sense of space and time, particularly because of the virus, because the physical spaces are very restricted for dancers now. And the entire field of choreography and the movements that are created are extremely wonderful to watch in terms of what they can do with little space and the creativity that it leads to. I cannot name anyone. I mean, yeah, I can only mention the Washington Ballet, but in the past 6 months, I've seen things that were really quite extraordinary. And the other thing I wanted to mention when Jeremy was talking about Cynthia Bourgeot is made me think about welcoming adversity, what I call welcoming adversity, to an understanding that one should not be afraid of change, and whether actually Gebser talks about adversity.
Interesting. Yeah, I think for him, it's a kind of a layered question, because adversity has different meanings. I mean, obviously, like oppositionalism is what he says is really at the core of this mental structure. And really the way through that is this sort of dialectical process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or that sort of pyramidal style of thinking. But in the integral, I mean, opposition, you could be very indirect and solve a problem as well. And I would even say like Anna Louise Keating's writing on post-oppositional politics is a good example of what that kind of what that might actually look like. I mean, a lot of what he talks about with oppositionalism, it has to do with, you know, the self and the other, right? Standing against one another. There's a very egoic oriented relationship there. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. It actually helps create a sense of self to push off the other. But with the aperspectival, the integral, he's often talking about really, you know, in a spiritual sense, a sort of primal trust, like a leap into the unknown, a vulnerability, an opening up of the self, not a deconstruction or like an undoing of a self, but the opening up and transparency, the overcoming of the ego, right, is for the human being concordant with the overcoming of this spatial consciousness that we've been talking about in the more cultural sense. Like they're integral to each other. And so I think a lot of this, you know, also has to do with what is the integrity of that kind of self, right? Like if we're moving back into the magic and mythic and we're reintegrating that, we're going to be dealing with forces and intensities that are kind of entangled and move beyond our sense of self. And we have to find some kind of way to reconcile that with this sort of modern, like Charles Taylor talks about, the buffered self, right? So there's a whole new interrelationship. All the structures have a new dynamic interrelationship in the integral. They all kind of find a different way to sort of coexist with each other. But again, part of that is what you're talking about, the kind of difficulty of overcoming our own ego inflation and rigidity, and really kind of becoming supple and open and trusting. And, you know, bringing forth a sense of self when necessary, but also being able to relax that as well. So I think, you know, implied in his work is this really difficult work, which is very personal. He talks about this, he has like he talks about the German phrase, like what we shout in the forest is what we hear back as an echo, right? So there's this like, and he gives these little hints, like, you know, what we really should do when we're dealing with interpersonal opposition and conflict, like, why don't we actually try to actually take everything in on it, like it's all us, like people are just reflecting everything that I'm putting out, and begin from there in a very humbling stance, and then work out, you know, in clarity, like what's really coming from us and what's not. So there's a psychology there as well, I think, you know, implicated in that work. But again, I would lean again to the theme of spiritual trust, or this spiritual opening of the self.
Thank you.
Somebody else?
I got one more for you, Jeremy, if there's nobody else. I'm curious about Gebser's insights into the masculine and the feminine, because you talked about this opening and this kind of thing. And so it sounds very feminine. It's like, are we moving into a feminine age? Is that his idea, or does he have a different idea? Or
I think Gebser's very clear about avoiding any kind of like oscillation back and forth with the integral. I think he's really interested in, like what we were talking about before, reintegrating magic and mythic, reintegrating the feminine so it has a kind of a partnership with the masculine and being in that sort of dynamism. So for him, you know, I would say this though, that the integral structure in its characteristics are very Taoistic. Knowing when to let happen and when to make happen, right? Like being plastic and pliable, right? There's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of yin integration with the, let's say, the masculine yang that is really brought back in a dynamic way. So I'd say both. But he does, to be fair, he does really highlight, I mean, one of the characteristics he talks about with the integral structure is the supersession of patriarchy. I mean, so he's saying like, okay, we've been too much in the yang, we've been too much in the masculine, there has to be some kind of integration. And I've kind of visualized this with the Owen Barfield U curve that I had a conversation with Mark Vernon about this, in terms of like how similar it is with Gebser's writing, and that like, I know it's spatial, but like if you see the kind of unfolding of the structures culminating in the mental rational kind of like atomization where we are, the kind of retrieval process and reintegration also has to take place as part of the integral. So the feminine, the magic, the mythic, they're all beginning to come into play again in a much more pronounced way. And if we seem to be moving into the feminine, if we seem to be moving into like an archaic revival or a predominance of magic and mythic in electronic culture, it's only because of how much those forms of consciousness or orientations have been suppressed or kind of kept at bay, or we've over-relied on a particular masculine mental structure, right? So I think remediation is a better way to explain why those might come to the forefront for a while. But that's just my take, though.
Mm-hmm. Yesterday on the channel, we had some discussion from the men's movement, right? And the men feeling, you know, that we have to rediscover masculinity in some sense because the entire culture has become very, very, very feminine. So, I mean, these are very reductive terms, of course, and it's a complex discussion. But sorry, Tom.
No, I wanted to ask something that boggles my mind and ties in perfectly. So, you know, what does Gebser say in terms of, you know, what does he mean with consciousness? Because like the German word Bewusstsein always means to be aware of something, right? And so does he distinguish and differentiate between, say, consciousness and psyche itself? Because, you know, I was thinking psyche is mythologically speaking always, you know, shown as a female, you know, and consciousness itself mostly depicted as male, say Marduk, for example. So like the god with the eyes, and so like, you know, what does he say about? Does he differentiate between consciousness and psyche, and if so, what does he mean by that? And are there feminine and like masculine qualities to be found there?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, just in terms of consciousness and psyche, he distinguishes that quite a bit, and even goes after Jung a little bit in terms of a critique of structuring things as conscious and unconscious. I won't go into that too deeply, but consciousness for Gebser he associates with, interestingly, he associates it with originary presence, the capacity or an expression of originary presence. And so for him, that wouldn't be necessarily totally equated with psyche, and it's not feminine or masculine, right, in terms of its ultimate originary intensity. But psyche is more to do with that mythical, imaginal, psychistic-oriented form of consciousness or expression of consciousness. I would say in terms of the way gender kind of plays out, certainly that the mental and the mental rational world exaggerates or leans into the masculine. And the magic and the mythic as a kind of yin, again, there's a sort of darkness, and even kind of delineates this sort of the waking consciousness of the mental, and then the sort of nocturnal consciousness of the magic and the mythic, deep dreamless sleep of the archaic even, or the magical entanglement, mythical. He associates them with, I mean, quite literally, his friendship and association with Lorca was very much for him this sort of transmission of the magical and mythical consciousness, the unperspectival world. And he wrote about Lorca, going, Lorca in the realm of the mothers, right? So there is this matriarchal orientation he certainly sees in the unperspectival world, and more masculine oriented orientation in the perspectival world. I don't know if that directly answers the question there, but those are the associations he does tend to use in his writing.
Okay.
Yes, Heiner, you want to jump in? And anybody else too, if you got a question,
I cannot resist
feel free
because
after.
I got a very nice message privately from Ellen. I think you have to know these people. This Otto Scherli was an architect. He was also working with Kückelhaus, and he was like 20 years running around with Gebser. And there have been architects doing kindergartens and not redesign of monasteries to make it concrete. And I think the integration of space and time in extra spaces, R spaces, all this I'm very interested in. And I will add another link on the Forum for Freedom and Education I did with Charlie 25 years ago or so.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Heiner. Yeah, that was a big thing for Gebser. talking about architecture, and I'm a kind of an architecture geek, so I have no skill, profession, or training in it, but I love reading about it. I love the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and the different, movements and periods in the 20th century, because a lot of this, like, I think thinking about it spatially, right, the way in which architecture is able to fold and shape space in our relationship with time and space. Is architecture transparent? What is it doing between the inner and the outer, the inside and the outside, right? Gebser talks about, like, the new modernist architecture gaining the sense of transparency in its structure. I think that's really interesting and important, and it's a good analogy for us to think about not just architecture, but, creativity and aesthetics is going beyond just art and poetry, right? Like, what is the world in which we are making and interacting with? Like, how are we shaping that world as a media ecology, and how is that beginning to shape us? So if there is integral oriented architecture and economics and certain political structures and systems and shifting gender dynamics, these are shapes and structures and environmental reshapers of our own consciousness, right, that might lean into the aperspectival. So I think thinking about it architecturally is a really useful tool for integral-oriented thinkers to kind of go, like, okay, how do we create an architecture of the integral? How do we promote this as an environment that can open space and perhaps open time? So it's really interesting questions.
You see, a friend of Gebser was Sharon. Sharon was building the Philharmonie in Berlin, and he was really going beyond the rectangle and the grid. So this experience of an embodiment and appreciation of Anschauung of space and design is actually what is needed, and it's Gestaltung, it is not design.
Well said. One other comment I'll just make briefly is this in terms of, like, moving away from architecture a little bit into, like, the present moment. We have to really think about how, again, the aesthetic sense is maybe not there yet in a very clear way, but I've been very interested in the literature on posthumanism and literature on particularly Debashish Banerjee's writing on integral yoga and posthumanism, and then also the Anthropocene. Now, a lot of people debate about that terminology, but the thematics of it is, okay, well, what happens when the human world breaks into the non-human world? What happens when they're entangled with one another, when there is a sense of transparency, and there's no longer this capacity to distantiate civilization from the biosphere? I think these kinds of inquiries into the post-human is also a sort of a beginning of the shape and aesthetics of the future, and becoming animal again, but not dissolving the human. It's this new reality in which they're entangled with one another in this transparency. It's very interesting, and existentially, it's critically important to begin thinking like this. So I really like Tim Morton and hyperobjects and the kind of aesthetics that they're playing with as well. I think that's sort of an expression of this. Maybe not sufficient enough, maybe too intellectual or conceptual still, but it's in there. And I think this is just a kind of realism that we're dealing with anyway with the climate crisis. So, yeah, anyone else want to jump in? Anyone else have some comments, questions? Adam.
Hi, everyone. Jeremy, it was awesome. Every time, it's worth it. I just have a couple jokes about that topic, about the really the re-sacralization of tech. I told my girlfriend last night after some of our other sessions that I was going to put down my job title as a neo-animist tech necromancer, which means that I'm someone who tells people how to bring their technology to life by putting little sticker googly eyes on their phone. Or cat ears on the computer. And it's because I was reflecting on, I was watching some anime, and I was thinking about how younger people animate their technology early on. They will put cat ears on it, they will name the device, and they relate to the technology, the computer, whatever, in a less rigid nature separated way. They view it as part of a living world with them. And they've resacralized the tech in so many ways, and they've moved it back into a living thing, and it is made out of plant matter. I mean, it is made out of it is matter, and I've been thinking about how much, when I am kind to this tech that I'm working with, in the same way that I'm kind to something in the garden, it responds, and when I fight it, it runs away. You know, that we have an adversarial relationship with an illusion there, which is, the illusion is that anything could not be, you know, sacred or alive or humming, and it is humming. So that's my joke, and so I'm only going to be speaking in emoji from now on. So
Awesome, Adam. One quick quip actually about that. You know, I talk about this, my friends, speaking of cyberpunk and anime and everything, kind of growing up on in sort of the sort of mix of Japanese animation and Japanese culture mingling with sort of cyberpunk and American futurism. You know, I think Japan is very interesting in the way in which it has engaged with modernity, and that is a very animistic culture, and they have a totally different relationship with their material objects, including their technology, in a much more animistic way. So they're kind of an interesting lens into, like, well, how does the magical, mythical, animistic fold into the mental, you know, in different combinations. We're still, as you're saying, we're like, let's embrace it, and then there's other cultures that have just sort of had to bring it in because of where they were historically. And so I just think it's interesting. But yeah, that's great. Moses, did you want to jump into? I think you unmuted.
I have like so many questions spinning through my mind, and I can't really decide on one. That's part of the reason why I've been sitting here. So in terms of practicing aperspectivality, like I've noticed some of the earlier art forms of the 20th century, like you mentioned, like Cubism, where you have the example I'm going to give is a figure descending down the staircase, where Marcel Duchamp just showed a figure in multiple moments walking down the staircase in a very abstract sort of way. And I suppose in terms of practicing aperspectivality, one needs to basically consider all of the moments of one's life and of other lives kind of all together. Is that kind of an accurate assessment of the practice of integral consciousness?
Yes.
Or?
I would say that's like one way to do it. I think one of the things we've been practicing in our Cohering the Radical Present course, which is the Gebser course exploring these themes, is different exercises like that one, like kind of imagining oneself as a temporal being. That's a good one, just like imagining yourself past, present, and future, being in conversations with your future self. There's some really good exercises from Joanna Macy about like both speaking to the ancestors and then also speaking to your descendants, not maybe like literally necessarily, but like just you as this generation speaking to the future and people looking back at you and what are they saying. It's a very kind of mythopoetic, imaginal kind of space, but it's in that space that different temporics can kind of fold into one another. So I would say yes, any kind of exercise that helps us to actualize a subjectivity of time, to see ourselves as temporal beings. We had a wonderful class on Sunday with Brant Stickley, and he's doing Chinese medicine. That's his specialty, and some of the folks here can tell you about it. But he kind of used sort of these rhythmic cycles, right? Like your life cycle, the days and the nights is this kind of like oscillation, right? The particular cycles and seasons of your life. And if you start to visualize all these kind of rhythms and cycles and circles and waves, like this is you, right? This is you extended in participation with the cosmos and all of these different time forms that make you up. And for him, the aperspectival present is for him in acupuncture, it's the needle point of right now, how all of those different time forms interlap into the present and converge in the present, and how we can kind of feel into all those different time forms in the present. I think that's a really good exercise too. You know, anything that helps us develop a subjectivity and a consciousness of time. So I think that's a good exercise. Exercises like that are good. There's really good, like, fun literature. I think a lot of us are like even ambiently temporalized. Like, we have science fiction films like Interstellar, which is a good example in popular culture. We have really fun science fiction comic books that are sort of magical, APERSPECTIVAL, like Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, if you've ever read it. And then we've also got like, I'm just thinking of like Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being, which is about, you know, a temporal sense of self. It's much more literary. But I think there's examples and manifestations of like how to do this. And McLuhan would probably say the same thing. Like, it's really the art. It's really the kind of imaginative exercises, whether it's literature or film or media or own kind of practices, that help to instill that new cultural mentality. So that's a good one. One other one I'll mention, which I'm just vaguely mentioning it because I don't quite remember all the details, is Connor Habib had this really great exercise he shared with his listeners about basically kind of imagining your life in 7-year cycles, and then collecting as like a kind of collage every cycle, like all the different multimedia impressions that kind of really were important to you. So like when you're a kid, like this is the kid shows, and then when you get a little older, like the music of your teens, right? Like, and really just seeing this kind of multimedia self that's sort of, you know, extending through time and space is really interesting to kind of get that overlay. There's this emergent sense of self that you can kind of begin to feel into. So really interesting practices like that. That's a great question. That's like the question, I think, for us, is like cool to talk about and philosophize, but also like, how do we really kind of fold this into our own subjectivity or discover it innate to us, right? Which is probably what Gebser would correct me on. But
Okay,
yeah.
may I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this one, in Hansian metamodernism, or I guess Freinachian metamodernism, like, I guess go with either one. There is a separation between kind of complexity of thought, as shown via Michael Common's hierarchy of model of hierarchical complexity. Sorry about that. And sort of your code, like sort of what cultural code you're running. So whether it's like pre-modernism or modernism or postmodernism or metamodernism, if you've gotten to that point, is consciousness in the Gebserian view kind of a fusion between complexity and code, or is it more strictly code and your complexity is just kind of its own thing that he's not dealing with?
Yeah, no, good question. I would say it is a kind of a fugue, because there might be complexities of thinking of, let's say, the mythical consciousness that are really, really advanced. People who really live in these cosmic cycles and seasons and can, you know, I'm just thinking of like a master acupuncturist might be really good at that sort of rhythmic complexity and seeing all those like overlapping ripples, waves, and cycles of a human being and their health diagnosis, and moving into like cyclical time, maybe a cyclical cosmology if they're living in pre-modern times, really advanced and complex, not in a complexity that we have. So I think it's kind of a fugue in that sense, and it's really hard to make the same distinction, I think, for Gebser, because for him, like integrality, it's kind of like code, but then it's also, you know, there's different like levels or like forms of expression you might express integrality. Like it might be the cliche, you know, it might be just the felt sense that like, okay, teenagers just grow up and they don't really want to watch linear films anymore, and they just play with different time cycles and timestamps and scrub the media, you know, as a sort of hypertext, and they're just living in this new sense of time. And then there's like, you know, climate activists or climate scientists that are really kind of like studying deep time and really look at that entanglement at a whole other intensity and whole other level of complexity. So I don't have an easy answer either, but I think they're somehow folded into each other, interwoven. if we compare them. But yeah, thank you. Those are great questions, Moses. Danny, would you like to, or Tom? Sorry,
Are you,
I know you're the host
in
here.
any way familiar with performatism, like from Raoul Eshelman, that kind of model about what happens after postmodernity?
Can you refresh me about that?
Now,
Performatism?
to put it simply, he has this model how to describe art after and architecture after postmodernism, and he says, for example, in terms of literature or movies, like if an artwork is constructed in a kind of way that you are forced to abandon your disbelief. And so he says, for example, that in the movie American Beauty, the protagonist is dead, basically. But, because his voice is coming from the off and he's telling the story. And so, but it's structured in the way that you kind of must disbelieve abandon your disbelief to follow the story. And for him, it's kind of a good example of what happens after postmodernity. And so that kind of reminded me of what you were telling, about, our different sense of time in terms of climate crisis and all of that. So do you see any relations there?
I would say so. I think it's that capacity to, like Gebser calls it, a capacity for detachment. I would say sort of an equanimity, to not kind of like, what's the knee-jerk reaction? Like, okay, I don't believe this, right? Can you suspend that and still participate? And that in itself is like a subtle kind of move back into participation. Like there's a yearning to participate again.
Right.
There's a movement away from observation and analysis that's detached in the kind of cerebral sense, and a desire to engage again. Now there is that ironic detachment, and you have to kind of like ironically believe it, right? So I think that is that sort of, again, meta modern space of like oscillation between like, I don't really believe sincerely with this stuff, but we're going to do it as if, right? And I think that entertaining it as if is interesting. I mean, even like Jung has like a little hint of that when he's teaching about the active imagination. Like you let your unconscious talk with you as if it has something to say. There has to be that suspension. Right. So I would say, that practice is a good example of maybe this way in which we can initiate this detachment and allow the mental rational to kind of just relax itself, Right.
And that's interesting, because another example he uses is the book and the movie Life of Pi. Do you know that one? And so it's also like constructed in the way that you have two different sets of interpretations of certain events, like one more mental, rational way of what happened on that boat, and then one more mythological explanation, And so it's like you are by the artwork, you are forced to choose, and you are forced to work with these different layers and so and structures, and so that for him is also like a kind of good example of what happens.
Yeah, I would also say, I mean, with film, it's obviously like you're playing with point of view, and there's a lot of really interesting films that do that and make you choose. I would also say, like, to caution that as like being it. I think Gebser actually wants us to lean a little bit further, because I think there's a subtle fetishization of point of view and like a playing of different multi-perspectivalness, right? And that's not the same thing as this aperspectivity Gebser's talking about. Because that's just sort of multiplying the perspectival world and kind of going like, okay, it's actually really complex and everyone has a point of view and they have all these intersecting lines and let's play around with all of them. It's a kind of a subtle kind of offsetting of like really making that shift, which is a little bit harder to do. And I think requires more creativity, and just in terms of like, I don't know, if the mythic is not just a perspective, and we think like, okay, what's your worldview? Go into the mythic. What's your point of view from the mythic? That really requires you to do work on your sense making. Like, can I really feel into a sense of time? I can't really rely on that point of view if I need to concretize the mythic or the magic, right? The spaceless magic, for instance. Like, it really will challenge us. And I think that's what Gebser is really good at, is like, this is really going to give you a hard time as a modern perspectival self, and that's good. Actually, you really want to massage that and really get into there.
Right.
So
there's a question from Oliver. Do you want to ask that personally, or should I read it?
Oh, hey, Oliver. Yeah, feel free to jump in if you. have a microphone and video. Read it. Okay, cool.
Okay, so I will read it. Hi, Jeremy. Gebser didn't have the chance to experience the green postmodern culture and mindset in his lifetime, nor does he seem to have foreseen it. What can he tell us who all come from this green culture about integral in the sense of all of us, by contrast to Gebser? Can't help understanding it. That is some form of synthesis of green antithesis and traditional modern thesis. Do you can you read that, Jeremy?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me try to like.
No. But you can answer it, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a good question. We kind of only lightly touched on it. Like I was saying, like when we opened up the Q&A, is we haven't really looked into the postmodern green, but a few setup statements about that. I think for Gebser, since he died in 1972, he saw a lot of post-war thought, but he didn't really see, obviously, 1980s, Derrida, Foucault, that real kind of intellectual milieu that really kind of took over the academy. That stronger deconstructive impulse, right? And then, of course, the postmodern green you're talking about, I think we're all kind of familiar what that generally means. A few things with that. I think, generally speaking, the postmodern is an extension, as I mentioned before, of the modern. It's an extension of the perspectival world because it's using the same thematic motifs. It's using the same kind of deconstructive consciousness, except now it's kind of almost over-exaggerated and cutting upon itself. I mean, the fact, like, Derrida is a great example. Like, can anything be stated without really kind of questioning what we really mean by anything, right? So there's this sort of loss of ground, but it really is the same kind of practice of the perspectival sectoring or diuresis or hair splitting, right, that has been present in the mental from the very incipience. So in that sense, the postmodern is an intensification of the perspectival world and the mental rational. Now, to like kind of answer this, like what can you tell us who all come from this green culture about integral in the sense as this sort of as some form of synthesis of green antithesis and the traditional modern synthesis? I don't know if integral would be a synthesis. Well, it definitely wouldn't be a synthesis. One of the things he mentions first about that is that synthesis is very much a mental way of reconciling something, and only in a sort of temporary sense of you have two oppositional, like let's say modern and then postmodern, and they come together or they find some synthesis in between, and he's not looking at it or formulating it that way. This is a discontinuous leap for him. But I would say the postmodern in relation to like restructuring power, the resurgence of, restructuring gender relations, racial tensions, et cetera, to sort of, the emancipatory movements, the political left in the 1960s going onward, these kind of cultural eruptions for Gebser that tie into this deconstructive aspect as well. For Gebser, this would be kind of an interim period of the integral, aperspectival, and the perspectival world. When Wilber uses words like aperspectival madness, I think he's really kind of got it reversed. It's kind of a perspectival madness in the sense that the perspectival world has really deconstructed itself and it doesn't have a ground anymore. And so it can't really make heads or tails of the new reality, which is processual, which is temporix related, and it isn't sequential. It's that kind of simultaneity that McLuhan talks about. The perspectival world can't swim in that. It doesn't know what to do. So I would say, like, yes, postmodern green is a combination of both. It's an interim period anticipating some of the themes of the integral, reintegration of the feminine, reintegration of the other, political consciousness in terms of that. One of the things Gebser does tie in with the eruption of the integral world, back again with the steam engine, is the French Revolution and really the birth of the left, the arising of the left. And he talks about this relationship between left and right. Directivity is this movement from left to right in at least Western culture. And so for him, seeing the eruption of the left is actually kind of, this hasn't been integrated, right? This needs to be folded into the whole. And the mental consciousness has been very good at getting away from all of that and keep going on forward. There's so much that needs to be integrated now. And so there's a kind of stopgap that's happening, and all of these things are crying for integration. I would say rather than a synthesis, though, for him, the integral is this sort of orthogonal move. it looks like a retrieval, it looks like a reversal, and it looks like a disorientation in that the whole needs to be weared. And so our usual movement of left and right, even that needs to eventually be subsided somehow. But that's another conversation. I have no idea if I answer that well enough, Oliver. But that's a really good question. And I've always mentioned this too, is like the green is not, we have to see green in the context of the perspectival world predominantly, because those are the themes. Like even on the internet, right? Breakdown, the left infighting each other and all these different factions and oppositionalisms and the atomization of culture, the atomization of language, the desire for us, and particularly in our sense-making communities, to do mimetic mediation. This breakdown is very much an expression, I think, of this deficient perspectival world that's collapsing on itself. So I hope that helped a little bit.
Why do you think that Wilbur has such a different reading of Gebser than you, for example, in terms of certain topics?
I think he's a brilliant developmentalist. He's a genius with really thinking in that style in terms of conceptualization, spatializing, synthesizing. There are people who are really good at that, and I think he's very uniquely brilliant at that. And I just don't think he really sees it like in a way that maybe like an engineer may not get a poet. It's just like it. He's seeing it a completely different way. He's like paying attention to other aspects. But
like a dumb question, shouldn't he see it?
Yeah, I think he should. I mean, I get a little frustrated sometimes with he changes the language a little bit where he talks about Gebser. He says Gebser has these stages. He doesn't have stages, obviously. Archaic, magic, mythic. And then he moves from, instead of mental, he calls it rational, which is a very, very wildly different thing, a very different distinction that Gebser talks about. And then he adds a made-up one, pluralistic, after that, right. Which Gebser never talked about that. Obviously, that would be a very green statement to make in terms of it's very anachronistic of Gebser to make a statement like that. So I think he really misreads Gebser, but it is through his developmental or linear spatial style of thinking. I think that's why he overshoots. A mismeasure, right, is in German. Isn't there a link? I remember Gebser talking about hubris and mismeasurement being kind of etymologically tied with each other. I feel bad just going, but I appreciate Wilbur, but I think this is just the reality of him mismeasuring Gebser.
Sure. So I think we have time for a last question. Heiner, would you like to ask?
I just wanted to go back to what you just said about Ken Wilber. I was in the early 80s in Denver and then Boulder and Aspen and before in Berkeley. I had these deep discussions about the beginnings of holism with Jan Christian Smuts and later with Gebser. And I think Ken, he is very intuitive, but not reading the originals, or most were not available in English anyway those days, and not really having the scope of the synchron optical of Gebser. So that's the template, a grid, a scaffolding, which is simple, coherent, and complete. Then he just got Gebser into hierarchical scheme beside many other hierarchical schemes and order systems. And we had many discussions about that. It is not so simple with Gebser than with other orders and cosmologies of the world.
Yes, agreed. And I'll just mention, if you don't mind, Tom, as well, with Heiner, Kettle was mentioning in the comments, pitting Gebser and Wilbur into an opposition. Are we not falling into a trap of the perspectival that contradicts Gebser himself? I don't think we should see them as an opposition. I just think Gebser is doing something orthogonal to Wilbur. Can we create the new statement? Can we fold temporics and process into our thinking and in our concepts? It looks different. It just looks different from what Wilbur did. It's not an opposition. It's just something that hasn't really been as realized. I think Nora Bateson does it in her work with symathesy. Gebser called it systasis, right? Can we work with quantitative spatialities and temporal intensities that are more qualitative, like warm data, for instance? So I'm just saying, like, in terms of that, it's orthogonal to Wilber. It's not in opposition.
Andrew, you have a last question?
Yeah, I have one more question. I want to know what Gebser's theological point of view was, because or what he thought about God. It sounds like because I'm a Vajrayana Buddhist and I'm not interested in Dzogchen. It sounds almost like Gebser has an intuition of Dzogchen Buddhism. This APERSPECTIVAL thing is like Dzogchen Buddhism in some sense, that there's no that there's a complete simultaneousness of reality rather than this sort of levels and yeah, in a sense.
Agreed.
That makes sense.
Very much. Just like a few notes on that briefly. He talks about in his own writing, he talks about this a bit, like in one of his later works in the 1960s, when he's talking about integrality. He's like, I'll just read the line, like, one cannot make this transparency visible, one cannot see it. Indeed, one is only able to become perceptibly aware of it, in the sense of the word aware, through effortless intensification of wakefulness. It's almost like a contemplative injunction there, and like how to approach it. But it is more than clarity or illumination, more than transfiguration or glorification, more than radiance. One could possibly speak of it as a flashing forth or sudden shining through of the whole. And later on, he talks about it as like a lucidity, right, as a language. It's neither the darkness or the light. It's neither the waking conscious nor the deep sleep. It is this sort of clear light, right, which shines through the whole or presentiates the whole. And that's what he talks about with his integral consciousness. So it's very... I would say it's very related to Dzogchen, and I've talked with a few folks who are Dzogchen practitioners, like Jared Jeans is very much in the Vajrayana tradition, and we had a few interesting conversations just off the record, just talking about it. And one of the things he says, like, it sounds like Gebser's talking about the same contemplative realization that my own tradition has its own language for. But there's other things we probably can unpack another time about his Christian orientation. Beautiful, beautiful integral Christianity that is implicit in ever-present origin here and there. But for another time, but it's along the same kind of clear, radiant lines.
I'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jeremy, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate that. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. This is really fun.
Yeah. Wish you all the best with your book, and I hope maybe we find other dates where we can have like other Parallax events where we might participate in the future.
We'd love to. It'd be really fun.
Yes. So to all other, thank you that you joined and made this an interesting evening. Next week, next Tuesday, 24th, John Bunsell will come to the program. He will talk about Simple. That's a new approach to voting and collaborative voting, which we can force basically the politicians to, be more useful to us. That will be fun. I hope you will all come. So I wish you all a great evening, a great night. And
one thing to add, we also have Cattle Last on December 2nd, and he's in the audience, so that's why.
Oh, right. Okay.
We'll be talking about, we talked about sex, and now we'll be talking about masculinity with Cattle Last.
Perfect. Thank you,
awesome.
Andrew.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.